Welcome in. Tonight, we're bringing you a special in the courts. In the next 30 minutes, we'll examine the pros and cons of legalizing marijuana in Maryland and discuss where does all the tax money go? Does it lead to more or less crime? And what will legalizing it do for those charged with marijuana possession? Don't move. It all starts right now. I'm Katie Barlow, and thanks for being here for this special In the Courts episode. We start with President Joe Biden's announcement in early October. He pardoned thousands of people who had been convicted of marijuana possession under federal law. He urged governors to follow suit for those convicted of similar state charges. Biden also says his administration will look into whether marijuana should continue to be a Schedule I drug like heroin and ecstasy.
As I said when I ran for president, no one should be in jail just for using or possessing marijuana. It's already legal in many states, and criminal records for marijuana possession have led to needless barriers to employment, to housing, to educational opportunities. And that's before you address the racial disparities around who suffers the consequences. While white and black and brown people use marijuana at similar rates, black and brown people are arrested, prosecuted, and convicted at disproportionately higher rates.
Maryland's current and outgoing Governor Larry Hogan has not weighed in on Biden's move, but the candidates running to replace him both have a stance on the issue. Democratic candidate Wes Moore says he's all for legalization. His opponent, Republican Dan Cox, says he's against it. So what is Maryland voting on exactly? Well, on November 8th, Maryland voters will decide whether to legalize recreational marijuana. On the ballot, the question will read, do you favor the legalization of the use of cannabis by an individual who's at least 21 years of age on or after July 1st, 2023 in the state of Maryland? If it passes, the law would actually amend the Maryland Constitution, adding an article, Article 20, allowing Marylanders to possess up to 1.5 ounces of marijuana beginning July 1, 2023. It'll also direct state legislators to pass necessary laws governing the use, distribution, possession, regulation, and taxation of cannabis. Legalization will also have an impact in the courts. Anyone with a prior conviction of possession that would be legal under the new law will have their conviction expunged automatically. And anyone serving time right now for possession will be able to apply for resentencing. Experts say that's good news, especially for African Americans who have been arrested and convicted of possession in greater numbers than other races. And we'll have more on that coming up. So how do Maryland voters feel about legalizing marijuana in their state? Well, right now, it looks like they're in favor of it. An average of recent polls shows Marylanders will vote to legalize pot by a nearly 2-to-1 margin. A Washington Post University of Maryland poll in September found 73% of Maryland voters in favor of legalizing recreational marijuana for adults over the age of 21. And based on that poll, there's support across age, partisan preference, region, race, and education levels. But even with all of that support, there's still opposition in Maryland. Critics like Dr. Christine Miller, a neuroscientist and Towson resident, says there's not enough focus on the mental health effects of marijuana use. Although the law legalizes possession for adults who are over the age of 21, the Centers for Disease Control actually cites numerous negative effects of teen marijuana use, including problems with memory and learning and an increased risk of mental health issues. In fact, Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders, who is pro-legalization, by the way, recently said that he worries students ask him about legalization so often during his public appearances. He says he's not a great fan of drugs and alcohol, but he still supports legalization. For adults, the CDC says marijuana use especially frequently, which is daily or nearly daily, and in high doses, can cause disorientation and sometimes unpleasant thoughts or feelings of anxiety and paranoia. So if Maryland legalizes, they'll actually be the last in our region to do so. D.C. legalized possession of up to 2 ounces of marijuana back in 2015. And it's still illegal to sell recreational weed, but you can transfer it to someone else so long as there's no payment made or any other type of exchange for goods or services. Now, this led to the so-called gifting businesses in the district. You buy a piece of art, for example, and you get your pot as a thank you gift for your purchase. Now, D.C. announced a joint cannabis task force. I kid you not, that is the name of it. And they were supposed to start cracking down on the gifting businesses by running inspections for compliance with D.C. regulations on food safety, fire code, registration with the tax office. The status of that task force currently up in the air. Now, across the river in Virginia, the Commonwealth legalized possession of 1 ounce last year. If you get caught with more than that, you get a fine, unless you're intending to sell or distribute it, which is still against the law. But the Youngkin administration actually made efforts to recriminalize possession of smaller amounts earlier this year. His proposed amendment would have made possession of 2 ounces a misdemeanor, punishable by 6 months in jail, up to a $1,000 fine. Higher penalties if you got caught with more, but the proposal actually got pushback in the state Senate.
But a handful of people that didn't include a single member of the Legislative Black Caucus deciding new criminal penalties going forward with no real opportunity for public input is concerning to add criminal penalties. And I hope that that is not a process we choose to use in the future.
Governor Youngkin's amendment failed when the Senate didn't advance the bill. So, well, President Biden's announcement only affects those who have been convicted of simple possession. It doesn't change the fact that it's still illegal under federal law. Since 1970, cannabis has been classified as a Schedule I drug under the Controlled Substances Act. Same as heroin, same as ecstasy. Schedule I drugs, they're defined as having, quote, a high potential for abuse and no currently accepted medical use in treatment and, quote, a lack of accepted safety for use under medical supervision. In his recent announcement, Biden said that his administration would take a look at whether cannabis should continue to be considered a Schedule I drug. But for now, it is, until Congress does something about it.
It is time to end the federal prohibition on cannabis. And this bill provides the best framework for updating our cannabis laws and reversing decades of harm inflicted by the war on drugs.
In July, Schumer introduced major legislation that would repeal federal prohibitions on marijuana. The bill included Democratic and Republican priorities, from expunging weed-related records, similar to what Maryland is considering, to law enforcement funding to combat illegal cannabis-related activity. And it also looks like there's a bipartisan support for legalization. The Brookings Institute recently clocked congressional primary candidates, their cannabis positions, by party. Now, there's support from both sides of the political aisle here, although there's stronger support on the left. The question going into next Congress is whether legalization will be a priority for lawmakers, no matter who takes the majority. Coming up, we'll talk with a former Baltimore Raven about legalization right here in Maryland. Don't go away. Welcome back. Former Baltimore Raven Eugene Monroe is the campaign chairman for Maryland's ballot question to legalize recreational marijuana. And I caught up with Monroe this week. Take a listen.
Eugene, you have spent a lot of time and effort on the legalization effort in Maryland and having this conversation about what's happening nationally. And on in the courts, we talk about all the legal news, we get wonky, but we also talk about the human story behind the laws that govern all of us. And you have an important story here. What made you want to get involved in this effort?
You know, I'd say I've been involved in this effort in Maryland since the second round of the push to legalize for medical use, when I was playing for the Ravens and was looking for alternative, ways to heal from pain and inflammation from injuries as a player. And at the same time, Maryland was opening access through medical licensure for companies to produce cannabis and companies to sell it. And so I saw what was happening and got involved in that process. And so since then, along with efforts to push the professional sports leagues to change their policies and also promote research in cannabis, now in Maryland, we sit here with yet another opportunity to expand that on another scale, but this solves some very unique issues, like the fact that while that medical industry I talked about exists, people are still being arrested for simply possessing marijuana in our state. And beyond that,
I wanted to ask you about that because this legal change will not just change people being able to get and possess marijuana, it's going to change what happens in the courts. And actually, you mentioned in your recent Washington Post article that Maryland is actually home to 3 out of 10 counties across the US with the highest marijuana possession arrest rates. This is going to expunge people's records. This is going to give people an opportunity to ask for resentencing who have been charged and convicted of possession. How is this going to change not just policy and being able to sell it in the state, but in the courts?
Yeah, what you talk about with people in the courts, right? This has torn families apart in Maryland. Not only do they have that possession charge, it prevents them from getting housing, it prevents them from getting jobs. And so, this can rectify, a lot of communities in Maryland where these laws, have torn people and prevented, real opportunity for them. This can create real access to opportunity for them, access to participate on the industry side of this even. And so voting yes on 4 this November, we're not too far away. Will certainly, help get those people, back in society, back where they need to be, back with the same opportunity that we all enjoy.
Let me also ask you, because this is, while there's a lot of support in Maryland, there are people who are opposed to this moving forward. What do you say to opponents, particularly those who are concerned about, for example, the CDC cites negative health effects on teens? This law would only legalize it for those who are legal adults, but having more in the market might make it more accessible. What do you have to say to opponents, just quickly here at the end?
Hey, yeah. So those who are concerned with cannabis legalization affecting teens, again, this legalization effort legalizes cannabis for adult use and for adults to possess cannabis. We're not talking about teens and we're not talking about children. And again, this will, certainly increase the amount of cannabis in the regulatory space. However, we also know that there's another marketplace that exists as well. And so we also hope that, one, we can drive people who do want cannabis to tested product that has gone through, layers of security because there's, the potential for people who buy cannabis in an unregulated space, to buy tainted products. And we've seen, that happen on a wide scale across our country during the past years. We've even seen entire cannabis market shift as a result of tainted products. And so, that's another reason as we talk about cannabis on a medical basis, on its uses for people to relieve themselves, from many of the conditions they face. They can also trust the product that is in a space that's regulated. And so, there's many reasons why, voting yes, one, first and foremost, like we touched on, getting people's records expunged, getting people out of jail, stopping the arrest, right? That can help police refocus their efforts on violent crimes. And we also know that across Maryland, police offices are experiencing hiring shortages. And so we can refocus that, effort on, more important things than policing cannabis.
Eugene, thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you so much for having me, Katie. Thanks for covering this.
Again, a special thanks to Eugene Monroe for joining us. But up next, there's another side to this debate. Not everyone's on board with legalization. We'll talk with an opponent coming up. Welcome back in. Opponents to legalization in Maryland are worried about health effects, particularly on young people, and how the industry develops, sometimes to the detriment of minority communities. Joining me to talk about it is Will Jones. He's the Director of Community Engagement and Outreach for SAM, which stands for Smart Approaches to Marijuana. Will, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Katie. Glad to be here.
So we talk a lot about the law on this show. We get into the legal weeds and the nerdy part of it, but we also talk about the human stories behind the law, lawmaking, and policy choices. And you have a real on-the-ground view of how marijuana affects our local community. You're a firefighter in Washington, D.C. You have that human experience and stories. So how did you even get into this position in your work with SAM?
Yeah, so for me, like you said, I work for the fire department in DC, and just throw out there, I don't represent the fire department at all, but it gives me a perspective of how our laws and how our, especially our drug laws, how they impact people. And the approach that we take at Smart Approaches to Marijuana is we really want to take a public health approach to the issue. When I started working on the issue where I lived in DC, the closest store to my house in any direction was a liquor store. And I tell people you can go a little bit farther and maybe get to a convenience store, and next to that you'd see it covered with advertisements for alcohol, tobacco. And I see, again, just from work as a first responder, I also see the impact that not just illegal drugs, but that our legal drugs have on people and on society, and the public health costs that has. And so when I heard regulate marijuana like alcohol in DC and other states looking into that, I was actually somewhat concerned, because what we've done with alcohol I don't think is the greatest. And especially when we look at the impact in disadvantaged communities and minority communities, where here in Maryland, Baltimore, there's 8 times as many liquor stores in minority communities as other places. We really believe that we can move forward with marijuana policy in a better way than recreating what we've done and allowed with the alcohol industry and the tobacco industry.
Your words actually echo what Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders said recently at an event. He's been going to visit a lot of young people at schools, and he said it worries him how often legalization comes up, that he's in favor of legalization, but he also worries about how focused they are on it and some of the impacts that it has on our communities. He said he's no fan of alcohol and drug use and its impact on our community, but still a favor of legalization. So let's talk about Maryland. It's coming up on the ballot. They're looking at legalization. It seems likely. You echoed some of the concerns here, but how can you find that kind of reasonable in-the-middle approach that you were talking about?
Yeah, 100%. So we definitely need to move forward with our marijuana laws past punitive policies where people are getting arrest records, or even worse, getting incarcerated for using a substance, right? It should be treated as a health thing as most, not as a criminal justice issue. The Biden administration, I think, just gave a great example of productive ways where we can have targeted reforms. So whether that's expungements, whether that's resentencing, or also decriminalization, those are policies that we can look at that are focused on the issue of the wrongs in the criminalization that we've had for marijuana in the past. However, creating a multi-billion-dollar industry, there's an article in the Washington Post that said it would bring in more than NFL if it's legalized at the federal level. That has some concerns, because these industries literally profit off of addiction. When we look at the alcohol industry, 75% of their revenue comes from people that drink on average 10 drinks a day. Most people don't know that, but that's where most of their money comes from. Same thing with the tobacco industry. We see an outsized negative public health impact from people that smoke a lot, and we see 300,000 to 400,000 deaths per year from smoking-related illnesses. And so when we talk about the idea of bringing in an industry, I think we move past righting wrongs, which I think Maryland could do that through decriminalization, expungements, resentencing, things like that are productive. But when we bring in legalization, that's introducing an industry that has a massive advertising budget. Their number one goal is to get as many people using as much as possible, and that has a negative public health impact. And we've seen that in states that have legalized, like Colorado, Washington State, California, seeing increased use of youth rates, driving under the influence, and things like that.
I will say a part of Maryland's question for if it is legalized does include that criminal justice component in part, where there will be an opportunity for expungement after a certain period of time. And if you are currently convicted for possession of the amount that then is legalized, if it goes through, you'll have the opportunity to ask for resentencing. But it sounds like there's more to do. And it sounds like also that it is going to move forward in Maryland. So what is the next step for SAM on educating the public, talking about that criminal justice component, making sure that people understand the repercussions if it goes forward?
So it's exactly really painting the picture of what happens when we allow an industry that profits off addiction, which is what the marijuana industry does. When we allow that, what's the impact that's going to have in our communities? And so whether it's legalized or not in Maryland moving forward, we want people to be aware. We want people to be aware in their communities of steps that they can take. If, for example, if you don't want to have a dispensary on every other corner in your community. In Colorado, there's more pot shops than Starbucks and McDonald's combined.
That is something in Colorado. Interesting to see if that'll happen in Maryland.
Exactly. So those are the things, productive things that we think, for people should have a say in the input of how this plays out in their community and how it impacts, people they love.
Well, Will Jones, thank you for sharing the work that you do with Sam. Also, thank you for your work in D.C. with the fire department as well. And thanks for sharing your knowledge with us. We'd like to have you back after Maryland votes. We'll see which way it goes.
All right. Thanks, Katie.
All right. Coming up after this, we'll tell you how and when you can vote in Maryland. Don't go away.
Now that we've done an entire episode on question 4, all that's left for you to do is go vote. And no matter which side of the issue you side with, we hope we've given you enough information to help understand what's at stake. So make sure you get out and vote early. Early voting in Maryland started this past Thursday. It goes through Thursday, November 3rd. Early voting centers are going to be open from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. You can vote early in person or on Election Day, which is Tuesday, November 8th. You can register on Election Day or when you go to vote early. And if none of that works for you, you can also vote by mail. You don't even need a reason to vote by mail in Maryland. You can request a mail-in ballot at elections.maryland.gov, or we've got all the details on our website at fox5dc.com. Now, you have all the tools and more information on legalization. Stay tuned for a second special episode on the results and marijuana legalization across our region. That'll be after the election, November 8th. Make sure to join us for our regular time slot, Sundays at 11:30 p.m. We'll see you then. Have a good night.
You're in the mood for empathy, it's blood in my pen. Better yet with your friends and them. I really want to know you all. I really want to show you off.